Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of What Israel Is, and boy is this a doozy. So, November 9th, wow. I must admit to have felt like taking a punch to the gut, waking up on the morning after, and it was kind of weird. I had this experience upon taking up my phone and typing in CNN.com. I said to myself, it's gonna be Trump, it's gonna be Trump, kind of to soften the blow in case that it was going to be him, but also kind of to jinx it. Obviously that did not work. And then I admit to have experienced during the day a kind of hastened 6 stages of grief. There was definitely shock. There was a lot of denial. There was anger and this kind of clutching at anything resembling hope. And there was depression. And finally there was acceptance. And the acceptance, I guess, was also a kind of a ray of light for me. A real hope, maybe. And this hope was that maybe, possibly, from here on out, people on the left will be willing to look reality in the eye and maybe start talking to people instead of at people or over their heads. But also, and this is maybe unkind of me, but I also felt a bit of Schadenfreude, this glee in the pain of others, I suppose. Upon looking at the responses of people on the left, there was this sense of shame that I started feeling, and it kind of translated into a knowing kind of glee. And it was, I'm following the anti-Trump protest a bit, and I must admit that, burning the flag, really? If I were a Trump voter, and I voted for Hillary, I'm a dual citizen. If I were a Trump voter, I would have felt vindicated as hell upon looking at these anti-American little twats burning flags. Ridiculous. America, really? You deserve this. In all the pain that it brings to me to say this, you deserve this. And if you don't wake up, if you don't get the slap in the face from what happened, this is just going to keep happening, and not just in America. I need this to be clear. You've lost. Hillary lost. She's conceded. The Electoral College is not going to vote Hillary in. This is real. And it's because of you. Alright. Now, what can we do about this? This is a different question. But first and foremost, accept that the way you've been treating some people has not been conducive to the left regaining control over the presidency. But if it were not clear enough what I'm looking at here, well, looking at what happened in Britain and looking at what happened just now in the States, I can only expect a resounding victory for Eurosceptic parties across the European Union. I can only expect Front National, the far-right French party, to take control over the French Republic. I can only expect a landslide for Alternative für Deutschland, the Alternative for Germany party, again a far-right party. I can only expect those things to happen in the following 2 years. And if you too can see this happening, and if you too do not wish for it to happen, then changes must be done. We can no longer afford to try and mitigate and squirm and do all of these types of verbal acrobatics around topics that are, how do you call them, problematic. We must admit to mistakes. The way, for example, that the migrant crisis in Europe has been addressed is nothing short of catastrophic. And this brings me to home, I guess. I feel like a lot of the way that leftists in America have taken this, and looking at their ages, I can only assume that we're talking about people who were raised, who grew up in a triumphant age, that these people grew up in this era of victory, of coming from the dark into the light, and have never known loss. And so they're lashing out like little babies. Whereas I feel like for me, it's the exact opposite. I grew up in primarily the 90s and the early 2000s, and then so I was about 7 years old when Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was murdered, was assassinated, and about 8 when the labor lost following the assassination. And then in 2001, when was it 2000 or 2001? Never mind. When Ehud Barak lost to Ariel Sharon, and that was the last time a prime minister was elected from the Labour Party. So that's about 16 years since the last time my side of the political sphere has been in power. And it also feels like maybe there's zero introspection as far as the left is concerned. And maybe in Israel it's derived from this deep sense of depression and hopelessness. Like, it's been so long that the prospects of it ever happening again are null and void. Obviously, this isn't conducive either to success, but there's a lot to be said, and I want to continue the discussion from the last episode about the Israeli Labour Party, shortly just the Labour, about how it came to be this way. So what's happening is essentially that while it is among the parties that hold primary elections, it is, well, the way it's done is nothing short of corrupt. And this is also kind of true as far as any other party that holds primary elections is concerned in Israel. I mentioned on the latest episode, I mentioned the Israeli Laborers Federation. What it is essentially is a federation of several of Israel's biggest workers' unions. And they have a stranglehold over labor politics in Israel. The way it works is that they mobilize huge amounts of people during the primary elections within the party. Many of them are not even politically motivated. Many of them are paid to vote. And this way they ascertain that the leader of the labor is somebody who's essentially in their pocket. This happened several times over with several leaders at the labor who were politically assassinated by the Laborers Federation. Most recently, there was Sheli Yechimovich, who was at the head of the Labour Party and was ousted in favor of Yitzhak Bougie Herzog, who is this slug who currently leads the party. And she was ousted because she got into several disagreements with heads of workers' unions and with the head of the Laborers' Federation at large. So this is not transparent. This is something that everybody can see. Everybody knows that the Labour Party is a corrupt party, and that people are voted in for having the right connections, and that it's a party rife with disloyalty and betrayal. That people who rise to the top have done so over the backs of opponents. So this is one of the reasons why public perception of the Labour Party is this bad. Now, the same can be said of the Likud, of the ruling party. But there are other things that make voting for the Labour unviable at the moment. So, for one thing, the Labour is often accused of racism. Now, the accusation here has a historical context, which I explained last episode. Essentially, the Labour in its former incarnation as the Israeli Laborers' Party did in fact discriminate against Jews who were essentially Mizrahis and Sephardic. Also, some Ashkenazis. As I said, it was primarily a thing about they favored people from specifically the countries which they themselves came from. So Romanians and Hungarians and Germans also were treated fairly poorly, but other things were still playing more in their favor. For example, the thing about having a smaller family and being more adapted to this type of European culture. So they were more effectively integrated. So there's this historical context to the accusation, but also I feel that the reason this accusation is so effective is because they are well aware of how vulnerable leftists are to accusations of racism. Essentially, what the right wing in Israel has done is weaponize the this whole political correctness agenda against the left. So probably the opposite of what you see anywhere else in the world. Whereas in America or in Europe, you see the left wielding political correctness against the right. In Israel, it's the other way around. And it is all the more effective because the left is so afraid of being called out on issues of racism. And then there's a whole thing about being called a lefty is effectively an insult in Israel. This can be tied to a particularly loathsome person, an American Jew. I think he resides in Florida, by the name of Arthur Finkelstein. And Arthur Finkelstein is a highly intelligent political advisor and campaign manager who works primarily with the Republican Party in America and with right-wing parties in Israel. He has worked with Benjamin Netanyahu and also with Avigdor Lieberman in Israel. And his modus operandi is essentially taking the descriptor of the opposing party and repeating it in such a way that it becomes an insult. And he's done this in America with the word liberal, where simply by repeating the word liberal, by right-wingers repeating that word in an unfavorable light, he has turned it into an insult. I feel that there's a bit of a reclaiming process as far as liberal is concerned in America. Certainly, right now during the civil war that's being waged within the left. But in Israel, the word leftist is almost dead. And the way that the labor has tried to manage this situation is by renouncing the left, by claiming to be a centrist party. I favor this kind of a metaphor. Imagine that you are in your teens again and you're walking in the school corridor or something, and while you're walking through the hallway, somebody calls you. He says, "Hey, fag." Now, there are several ways you can react. Obviously, you can try and ignore him. And then the other two options here are to say, "I'm actually straight. I'll have you know I'm not actually homosexual. I'm really heterosexual and I love girls." Or you can try to engage him in a humorous way, showing that you are not offended by him calling you that. I don't know, blowing him a kiss or something. Saying that you are not gay when somebody calls you that as an insult will not stop him from doing so. Right? It will actually show him that you take it as an insult, that this is a soft spot for you, and he will only double down on it. In much the same way, the Labour Party saying that it's not actually leftist does not convince the people who are calling them dirty leftists. All it shows is that they are cowardly and are not sincere about who they are, and would rather cowardly try to pose as something else, and with this kind of a ridiculous notion that if they say they're not leftist, then they'll be accepted. It's not just the ideology here. There's problems with how the public perceives the ideology, but you being chicken shit about this is certainly not helping, and everybody can see that. Everybody can see that's what you're doing. And they respect you all the less for it. So, what is the public perception of the left in Israel is essentially this. Somebody who's unpragmatically pacifistic. So, peace above anything else, and doesn't matter how, or, no considerations for the implications, and just peace now, which is also the name of an actual leftist NGO. Somebody who's unconcerned with security because of his dedication to peace, and cares more about the enemy than his own people, and so he's actually also disloyal. This is a giant hurdle to go over. The idea that this is what we're perceived as in Israel. The left must reclaim pragmatism and must somehow try and make peace sexy again, in a way that is not dreamy-eyed, but is nestled within a security-oriented agenda that is pragmatic. And once the left is successful in doing so, the whole idea that they're promoting peace because they care about the enemy more than they do about their own people, I feel like this will be less of an issue. But currently, the situation within the Labour Party is so that we are torn between schemy, slimy, agenda-deprived, immoral politicians, the likes of Bougie, and these kind of alien, moralizing ideologues. Does that sound at all familiar? I think it might. If you don't want to look at 16 years of soul-crushing loss and desperation, wake up. Soon. Now, preferably. Wake up. Until then, have an awesome weekend. See you guys.